And the really thing that's interesting to me is that her lifetime overlapped every president from John Adams to Dwight Eisenhower.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. Dwight Eisenhower was born in like 1899 or so, and she didn't die until 1915. During her life, the U.S. population went from 5 million to over 100 million. And the number of stars on our flag went from 23 stars when she was first born to 48 stars when she died. In 1820, James Monroe was the 5th president of the United States. And at that time, the Mayflower of Liberia sailed from New York to return 86 black slaves to Africa. And then in 1915, the year she died, Woodrow Wilson was president. He was the 28th president. And at that time, we had millions of recently arrived Southern and Eastern Europeans that at that time challenged Americans to adapt to greater religious and ethnic diversities and pluralism. So that was happening right around 1915. It was also when World War I started. In her young time, she had to ride in horse-drawn carts. And then by her time of her death, Ford had produced its millionth car. And railroads by that time crisscrossed the United States. So you can see that she lived in a time of amazing growth. From her birth until all that 94 years, was so much that happened in the United States. And there were a lot of cultural changes because she lived in New York, as we'll talk about, and that was a huge cultural melting pot because millions of immigrants came through New York and settled, and that led to a lot of cultural changes. And mostly she looked forward rather than backward, really embracing progress. And she yearned in her old age for a recovering of cultural reverence for the Bible. And so I don't think that's changed. I think all of us look for that. She also found it very distressing that there was an apparent breakdown in the stable family, and she thought that that befitted a God-fearing society, that we should and retain that outmoded state of dress. That was sort of her trademark through her life. She never really changed her dress. In 1915, styles had changed dramatically from the mid-1800s when she was a young woman, but she never changed her style of dress. And I have a couple of pictures somewhere. I'll bring them in a minute. She had a natural ability for rhyming, and that was sort of something that obsessed her from a very young age. And it really helped her relationship with burgeoning publishing companies, especially for the poetry. She didn't write just hymns. She wrote tons of secular poems. I mean, thousands and thousands of secular poems that we don't usually hear about because we always focus on she was a hymn writer. And indeed, she was the gospel queen. They noted the queen of gospel music and inducted into the Gospel Music Hall of Fame. She responded to urban poverty later in her life, and we'll talk about that, as she started frequenting the rescue missions in Manhattan, in Lower Manhattan, in the Bowery areas. And her life story illuminates a whole century of Protestantism in New York and all the things that went along with it. And you may be wondering if she was related to Bing Crosby, and she was. Her great-great-grandfather, his sons, one of the sons, Thomas, Simon, and then Thomas, Bing Crosby was an offshoot of that Crosby line. So they were indeed probably, like 5th cousins, 10th removed or something, but they were related. Her family was from England, and the Crosbys are very first mentioned in 1204. The name Crosby means the town of the cross. That's what the name Crosby means. And they were descendants of Susan and Ellen Crosby, who came over on the Mayflower. And let's see, Simon Crosby, her great-grandfather, owned land that was eventually donated for Harvard. So sometimes somebody might say that her great-grandfather founded Harvard, but he just owned the land that they bought for Harvard. So then let's get on her timeline a little bit here. Her mother was born in 1799, and she married one of her distant relatives named John. So they both were named Crosby. The mother and the father's last names were Crosby. It wasn't uncommon in those days for someone to marry cousins. Her grandmother was Eunice Crosby, and that was Fanny's maternal grandmother, who was the most significant woman during her childhood. Not only her mother, but her grandmother, because of how she was raised. So in her early life, she was born in 1820, and you can see in your timeline there are things that were happening in the U.S. Now, she became blinded, and I don't know how many of you know the story of how she became blinded, but there's some modern docs that look back and say, she probably was blind at birth, and the parents didn't know it. But what happened was she had a cold or a little eye drainage when she was about 6 weeks old, and her own family practice doctor wasn't around. So another guy came in, another doctor, and recommended these poultices of some kind of mustard and whatever, hot poultices to her eyes. And they did that to her eyes, so it caused permanent damage, is what the story is, and that's how she relates her blindness. So this is sort of, even in essence, a little bit of comfort to the family that she wasn't born this way, because some people took that as a personal defeat if their child wasn't born with a problem, so they sort of had a scapegoat to blame the blindness on, whether or not he was born from birth or whether she really did receive chemical burns. He would not have caused permanent damage, and poultices on the eyelids wouldn't have caused permanent damage to the cornea itself. So if the chemical got in her eye, it was a chemical burn, then yes, it could have caused permanent damage. So that's where she received her, actually the thing that made her who she was, as she says later. Her father died 3 months later and left her mother a widow with just the one child. And so her mother's name was Mercy, and Mercy instilled in her that Milton and Homer were two of the greatest poets ever, and they were both blind as well. And she said that sometimes Providence deprived persons of some physical faculty in order that the spiritual insight might more fully awaken. That's what she was raised with her mom. Her mom was more discouraged about her blindness than Fanny was. She was discouraged and she had anxiety about it. And so Eunice, the grandmother, is the one that encouraged both Mercy and her daughter Fanny about it and helped them learn to cope. The Bible was central to their home, but as we'll see in a minute, it didn't really, it influenced Fanny a great deal, but not with her salvation. We'll talk about that in a minute. Her family, the ancestors all understood that God had a purpose for whatever happened. Her whole family understood that. And they knew that God was the source of true pleasure, and they believed that they had, whether it was meager or abundant, was from God's hand. They took time in their hard lives to enjoy the wonders of nature, and they really gave Fanny an appreciation for nature, even though she couldn't see it. They would tell her about the shapes and the smells, and what she could smell, and the feeling in the air, so that she could appreciate nature, even though she couldn't see it. She says that the Calvinism of these sons and daughters of Massachusetts Bay was serious without being dour and joyous without being frivolous. I thought that was an interesting quote. So she was very, very intimately associated and knowledgeable about the poetry of Milton and the plays of Shakespeare, and she was very heavily influenced by John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress. As we know, that came out long before. So she read that a lot and looked on her journey as being a pilgrim. And she also knew the hymns of Isaac Watts. And she used to roam the forest with the Sheriff of Nottingham, and she traversed the Spanish countryside with Don Quixote. So she had a vivid imagination. So the exposure to all this literature that was read to her from the time she was a young child really helped influence how she was able to learn to speak in such beautiful poetic prose. There's this little story that she talks about when she was 3 years old. I'm going to read this. This is from her words. When I was 3, I had exhausted all forms of entertainment. My mother came to me and said, "I think I found something that will please you." Then she placed in my arms a tiny lamb that had lost its mother. A little orphan at once received the warmth of my affections. And through the fields and meadows we romped when the days were warm. And occasionally I fell asleep under a great oak tree with my pet by my side. But soon he grew into a strange creature, quite unlike the gently lamb that I had first known. For he used to throw me on the ground and tear my dress and make me cry. For a time I forgave him, but at last he disappeared. And not many days thereafter, the family had mutton for dinner.
No.
My pet had not returned, and I knew at once what had become of him, so I refused to eat meat that day. And I slipped into a corner so as not to betray the tears that I could not restrain. For many weeks I wore mourning in my heart for him. And one of my friends offered to replace my pet from the flock that he drove by our door. Though, much to the surprise of all my friends, I declined his gift. I reasoned, why should I again be deprived of a dear pet? I will have none, and then there will be no chance of it. But that was kind of an insight into her fortitude. The family then, let's talk about how they worshiped. They worshiped at the Presbyterian meeting house. And so she was heavily influenced by Presbyterianism in her early life. She learned the Bible from her grandmother. When they would sit at the rocking chair and her grandmother would teach her things from the Bible. And they would have prayers together. Now in 1825, she was 5 years old. Her mom took her to New York City to see a Dr. Mock, who was a renowned surgeon who was really an expert at all these complicated surgeries. And she came to have Fanny evaluated for her blindness to see whether or not the surgery would be able to cure her blindness. So the doctor then consulted with a few other people, and they said, no, there's nothing that can be done. And he even asked her, would you like to be able to see again? And she said no, because she thought that I'm okay the way I am. And she was worried that if she had this surgery and it failed, then her mother would be even more disappointed. So the journey in those days, as I talked about, she had to ride 7 hours from their little town up in middle upstate New York, probably only about 80 miles from New York City. But it took 7.5 hours by buggy ride just to get to the river. And then they got on a sailing vessel. And that could take anywhere from, depending on the wind, how long. So the voyage was always undetermined. When you got on the ship, you never knew when you were going to get off the ship, really. It's several hours, it could be a day or two. It would take 90 passengers. On board, they had a cow for milk. Passengers cooked their own food. And it was about a 30-mile journey is all it was by the river. But because of the traveling, and it was a sloop, it was only by sail, that they would just take however long time to get there. She says in these days she could see some light and dark if it was a very strong contrast. So sometimes if it was a very dark day, maybe the sun would hit trees a certain way and make them very bright, she could see a little bit of contrast. She also talks about being able to see the moon at one point because it was a very bright moon in a very dark sky. And I'm going to read you that in just a second. So when she got there, her figure, she was only 5 years old. She'd never been anywhere except this tranquil little town. It was indeed very tranquil, very quiet. And so this noise of the city really scared her and perplexed her. But she didn't get the surgery, and she went home. And she, at that time then, went home when she was 5 years old, continued to be taught. She wrote a poem. And that was on the slide, but I'm going to read you a little poem that she wrote. This is her first poem, very short. She says, "Oh, what a happy soul I am, although I cannot see. I am resolved that in this world contented I will be. How many blessings I enjoy that other people don't. To weep and sigh because I'm blind, I cannot, nor I won't." That's her first poem. In 1831, when she was 11 years old, her grandmother passed away. And she did write another poem for her grandmother, another very short one. So she would take opportunities of something special happening, whether it was a birth or a death or a marriage or a baptism, or write a poem about it. And she was known to say, "I can give you a poem." Somebody would say, "Fanny, could you write us a poem and have it ready like by 2 o'clock? And she'd say, "Yep," and she'd go and write poems if she felt like it. Here's the poem that she wrote after her grandmother passed away. "There are forms that flit before me, there are tones I yet recall, but the voice of gentle grandma I remember best of all. In her loving arms she held me, and beneath her patient care, I was borne away to dreamland in her dear little rocking chair." That's very touching. She wrote that for her. So after her grandmother died, Fanny's mom had to somehow eke out a living. So she took a job as a housekeeper and as a maid in different homes. And they moved around a little bit, and a lot of times when her mother was still working away and her grandmother was still alive, Fanny was home with her grandmother. But then when her grandmother passed away, Fanny had to go with. So they ended up, in those days, the help were treated as part of the family. They weren't looked down on as being help. They were actually revered as part of the family, given a place to stay within the home, treated as part of the Moy family. One family that Fanny and her mother lived with were the Hawkins. And so the Hollies. So Mrs. Hawley really took Fanny under her wing when her mom was off working. Not only did Mercy work in the Hawley home, she worked in other homes throughout the area, and this was in the same area of New York. So Mrs. Hawley had Fanny memorize. Fanny had memorized almost all of the first 4 books of the Old Testament. She had memorized all 4 Gospels and the Psalms and the Proverbs. And this helped her a lot because she ended up in Sunday school. They would have the kids stand up in the Sunday school and say their Bible verses. So this is another statement on pride that Fanny wrote later on in her life. Because she'd memorized most of the 4 books of the Bible and the 4 Gospels, she had this to say about it. At Sunday school, the children would stand in the aisles and repeat some of the passages they committed during the previous week. And there was considerable rivalry trying to recite the largest number. I often hunted among the records of my memory for the longest and most involved verses with the idea of showing my elders what a little blind girl could do, and they in turn flattered me with compliments and presented me with a fine Bible for reciting more verses than any other scholar. Had my growing pride been unchecked by my friends at home, it might have proven a stumbling block in after years. And yet the habit of thoroughly learning my lessons helped me many times when I was obliged to commit long passages as a pupil and afterwards as a teacher at the New York Institute for the Blind. That's what she had to say about that. I want to also say another paragraph she had about her grandmother's teachings. This was like really paramount to her. Fanny says, I often went to visit my grandmother who lived in the house where I was born. It was a great pleasure to report the progress I was making in the study of the Holy Scriptures. My desire for knowledge was increasing, but I found that the teacher in the village school, to which I often went with the children of my own age, was too busy to give me the personal help that I needed. Grandmother was very patient with me and did all that she possibly could for my happiness. When I went to see her, she always gave me the room that I liked best, and I shall never forget one night that I spent there. Toward twilight, she called me to hear her teachings, and both of us sat for a time in the old rocking chair. Then we knelt down by its side and repeated a petition to the kind Father, after which she quietly went downstairs, leaving me alone with my thoughts. The night was beautiful. I crept toward the window, and through the branches of a giant oak that stood just outside, the bright, soft moonlight fell upon my head like the benediction of an angel. And while I knelt there and repeated over and over these simple words, Dear Lord, please show me how I can learn like other children. At this moment, the weight of anxiety that had burdened my heart for so long was changed to the sweet consciousness that my prayer would be answered in due time. This was a little bit. Let's see. She also, when she went to school then, and so let's talk about 1935. She went to New York City. Her mother found out that she could get an education, so she's 15 years old now. And her mom says she can go to school in New York at the New York Institute for the Blind. So she's 15, she arrives in the city. It's been 10 years since she's been there. There's a tremendous growth in that 10 years. And she says 10 years earlier she had come to pursue light for her eyes, but now she came to have light for her mind. She wrote a poem about math. She absolutely hated math. So one of the poems she wrote about math said, multiplication is vexation, and division is as bad. The rule of 3 puzzles me, and fractions make me mad. So she had a very cool sense of humor. She had an episode at school where she was getting all kinds of praise from her friends, writing poetry and dropping the hat. And she became very, very pleased with herself. And so one day she was summoned to the superintendent's office, and she thought she was going to be asked to write another poem. So she all went very happily down there. And yet it wasn't that. He said to her, Fanny, you are getting a little too prideful in yourself. Your friends are giving you all kinds of praise that is yet not quite deserved. Yes, you have some nice poetry, but you have not yet attained what you are capable of doing. So you need to not write poetry for 3 months. No poetry for 3 months. So she was very upset about this. But then for 6 weeks, she didn't write a poem, but her studies started to fail. She couldn't recite stuff, she was distracted. So the superintendent called her back in and said, what's going on here? You're one of our brightest and best. She said, I can't concentrate, my mind still wants to go to poetry and rhyme things, and I just can't concentrate. He said, okay, fine, start writing your poems again, but just concentrate on your morning lectures and be sure that you're going to get your lessons done. So she then was allowed to write again. Then shortly thereafter, when she was probably about 17 or so, there was a Dr. Cohn who was a phrenologist. Does anybody know what phrenology is? It is. It's the study of the bumps and stuff on your head. And this, supposedly at the time, was a very well-grounded science. So this phrenologist, Dr. Cohn, came and examined Fanny's head and pronounced her to be a natural-born poet. So then the school was all over about making sure that she was really educated so that she could continue to write her poetry. She had a really great sense of humor. She liked to play jokes on people. And one of the jokes she did one time was there was a visitor that she was asked to take around the school. And this visitor, she didn't know who it was, this man, and she, even though she was blind, she knew where every step and everything was around the school. And she could practically run down the hall and turn the door and know exactly where she was. She had that sonar. And so this gentleman had a copy of her book, and we'll talk about this book that she wrote. And he said, I understand Fanny Crosby is here. Is she around? And Fanny said, oh yes, she's around. And then he said, well, is she very amiable? And Fanny said, oh no, not at all. And she never told him who she was. So it turns out later she finds out that this was this guy named Dr. Telkamp, who was a very noted scholar at Columbia University. So she kind of blew her opportunity there for a network that she had started creating during her lifetime. Another time she had broken a rule. She was sent upstairs to her room early. And she ran upstairs singing, my glad soul mounted higher in a chariot of fire, and the moon was under my feet. And she said, the superintendent then called her back and he said, you go too willingly. Don't break any more rules. Because she was happy to go to her room. They weren't allowed to go during the day. In 1844, as you see on here, I'm going to back up just a hint. In the 30s, I have that sheet. Then she also went to the Methodist Church for the first time and was influenced at that time, started being influenced by Methodism. In 1831, as a sidebar here, Andrew Van Alstyne was born, and that was going to be her future husband. So he was 11 years younger than she. And that's also the year Fanny's grandma died. And then you see here how she moved. In 1838, 3 years after she started school there, Fanny's mom remarried. And she married a man named Thomas Morris, who had been married once before. And he had 3 children from that marriage. And Fanny's mom married him like a month after she met him. And it turned out that he ended up falling into Mormonism. He heard when they were searching for new members, like the evangelism, if you want to call it that, of the Mormons. He went to one of their meetings and he really liked what he heard. And to Fanny's mom, she said, it fell on that falls on idle ears. That is not our teaching. But he became very enthralled with Mormonism. Even his oldest son was against it. But Thomas badmouthed Mercy, said she was this horrible woman, and he took his 2 kids and he left. Now, in the meantime, they were together 6 years. In the first 3 years of their marriage, the first 4 years of their marriage, they had 3 children. She had a daughter in 1939, that was Wilhelmina, and Wilhelmina died shortly after childbirth. In 1940 and 43, Mercy had 2 more children from Thomas Morris. These were Fanny's half-sisters. And these 2 girls became the delight of Fanny's life later in her life. I'm going to stop. Ken, do you know if Pastor brought my iPad back? He had it, he came in with it. It's pink.
Yeah, it's over there.
I never saw him set it down. Because I had a couple of pictures that I really wanted, we were trying to show some pictures up here, and for some reason we couldn't get my iPad to sync. So I'm going to just show you the pictures and then I'll pass it around. Preparing something. While it's preparing. So then he left to pursue his Mormonism in 1844. And a month later, in 1844, he stood, and as it was written, he stood over the lifeless body of his precious Joseph Smith, who had been murdered in Illinois. I think it was in, do I have it on here? Carthage, Illinois. Yeah, he died in Carthage. He was killed while he was in jail. So Morris was there, but he still went on out to Utah to seek more Mormonism. Now, let's go on to what was happening in New York at the time. So I think it's important to say that the religious climate at the time, when Fanny was first growing up and she first went to New York, Protestantism was the big deal, mostly Methodists and Presbyterians and Baptists. And then, because of things that were happening with immigrants, thousands and thousands of Catholic immigrants came to New York. One of the biggest influxes was the Irish that came because of the potato famine in 1845. So there started to be this movement uptown. It changed the whole climate, and one thing that was good about this is that the slaves in the South embraced Christianity, and they would have their services in the woods. That was just something that was came along at that time. So when she was 23, she joined a lobbyist group for supportive education for the blind. And in that year, she was the first woman to ever address the U.S. Senate, and the school had her go there. The local people in the local senators and congressmen wanted more funding, federal funding for the education of the blind. So they took Fanny to D.C. to have her read poetry, something that she had written for the occasion, to kind of show her off as what could happen with a blind person. Because until then, people kind of thought, well, the blind really can't be educated. So she was there to show how smart they could be, and she had a lot of people that she ended up meeting from that. She had a big, huge network. Now, when we talk about, I want to talk about Protestant elitism that was happening at that time. So what happened was, as the immigrants came into downtown Manhattan, meaning down by the Statue of Liberty in that area, all of you kind of been in New York City maybe, or you kind of have an idea what it looks like, right? So you're looking at the island of Manhattan, and closest down to where the Statue of Liberty is downtown. And that's where the immigrants came in, and that's where they settled in. The houses and the Bowery and all that was down there. The elite started moving uptown, and they made Central Park, and they started building bigger Broadway-type boulevards and nicer big brownstone houses and nicer things. And so the churches, they started selling off their land and moving uptown as well. So they had this thing, though, that was Protestant elitism. And there were certain churches that were better churches. And when people went to church, they not only dressed up, they dressed up almost as much as if they were going to the theater, to the opera most days. I mean, if they dressed nicely, they were on the street. But when they went to church, they were in their, when they say their Sunday best, that was the finery. And if you dressed in your best finery, you had better clothes than somebody over here, the pastor paid more attention to you than he did to the poor people. So then, and it also had to do with how much money you were giving to the church. And they paid for their pews. So some of the pews in those days were going for $10,000. We're talking in 1845. That's a lot of money to buy a pew. But if you had a certain pew and a certain clothes, then you were looked at as the elite. And the Protestant elites sort of lorded this over people that weren't quite as good. Fanny was maybe not as attuned to it because she couldn't see what people were wearing, but she certainly knew the vibe of it. But it never really affected her. She went to any church, depending on where they were having the revival service. So she went to the 30th Street Methodist Church for a long time, but there was a revival at the Baptist Church. She went down there. So that didn't really affect her, but this was going on. Now, let's go on to 1850, her conversion. I think this is really important to talk about her conversion. Because even though she had been raised with Bible teachings, knew all this, and memorized all this, she still didn't have a true heart for the Lord. She got very involved in politics. She loved to get involved in the latest political things. She didn't go out and actively support a candidate, but she would write about it and she would keep in tune. The other thing that happened at the school was that they were read to every evening from the newspapers. So they gathered them around every evening and read to the students. Let me see. So she was up on current events. So she knew about the current events, so she knew who was running, and depending on who she liked in their platform, she was either Republican or a Democrat or a Whig. In those days, they had the Whig Party that lasted a few years. But let's talk about when the cholera epidemic was, about 1849, there was a huge cholera, a second time, the cholera epidemic in New York. And it took the lives of 10 students at the institution. And she volunteered as a nurse. So she was 29 at the time, right? She was 29, worked as a nurse. And I want to tell you that was very interesting about these pills that they put together. The pills were 3 parts opium and 1 part mercury. And she helped the doctor that came to the institute to care for the sick kids. Over 600 of these pills that they made, little pills. So she had been caring for some of the people at the institute and started to feel sick herself, like they were coming up. So she says that she just kept walking and she just took, she said, a large number of them. She does this, a large quantity is what she said. I took a large quantity of these pills. So keep in mind they had mercury and opium in them. But she said she excused herself around 6 p.m. to say she hadn't slept in several days because she'd been nursing the sick children and having them die literally in her arms. So she excused herself at 6 p.m. and woke up the next morning and said she was well as new and felt great. So hopefully she didn't have to take any more opium pills after that. But I thought it was an interesting thing, and I want to go back and look at the history of the medicine part of that because I found it interesting as to why they thought the opium and mercury might help cure cholera. So we know yeah, she felt sick in the morning, she felt good. Well, then in 1850, on November the 20th, Fanny writes about her conversion. And I'm going to read this to you. This is in her own words. This was at the 30th Street Methodist Church at the revival meetings. Some of us went down every evening, and on 2 occasions I sought peace at the altar, but I did not find the joy I craved until one evening, November 20th, 1850. It seemed to me that the light must indeed come on then or never. And so I rose and went to the altar alone. After a prayer was offered, they began to sing a grand old consecration hymn, "At last and did my Savior bleed, and did my sovereign die." And when they reached the 3rd stanza, Here, Lord, I give myself away. My very soul was flooded with celestial light. I sprang to my feet, shouting, hallelujah. And for the first time, I realized that I had been trying to hold the world in one hand and Jesus in the other. But my growth in grace was very slow from the beginning. The next Thursday evening, I gave a public testimony at our class meeting. And when I finished, the tempter said to me, well, Fanny, you made a good speech, didn't you? And I realized at once that this was the old pride returning again to reign in my heart. For a few days, I was greatly depressed until a kind friend suggested that I go back and do the first works quickly. Her words. Which meant that I had not made a complete surrender of my will. And then I promised to do my duty whenever the dear Lord should make it plain to me. But not many weeks later, I was asked to close one of our class meetings with a brief prayer. My first thought was, I can't. But then the voice of conscience said, but your promise. And from that hour, I believe I never refused to pray or speak in a public service, and with the result that I have been richly blessed. So even though she was raised very close to all the scripture and knew it by heart, she still didn't embrace Christ until that moment and realized that she had been indeed holding on to the world. And in those years before that, was when she did write some hymns, but wrote a lot of secular pieces. After that conversion, then she started really delving into Christian gospel music. So in 1858, and you can see a few other things on the timeline there. In 1853, this is another interesting story. A young man, Grover Cleveland's older brother, came to the Institute as a teacher. And he had a younger brother who was 17 at the time, and that was Grover Cleveland, and brought him on to get a job at the Institute as a secretary. So Fanny could not write. She never really learned to write. She was in her 90s and she wanted to learn how to write her name, but she never knew how to write. Somebody called it a pile of spider legs, if you try to look at what she was writing. She never learned to write, and she didn't read Braille either. They, in those days, made embossed letters, so she actually would read capital letters, is how she learned. So she would transcribe everything. So she would dictate, so everybody would write what she was dictating to them. And she would even edit as she dictated. She was amazing. She even could, when she was working full-time for the publishers of the music and writing several hymns a day after day, she had two secretaries, and she would be able to dictate simultaneously two separate hymns to two separate secretaries. She'd do 2 lines of this secretary, go to 2 lines to that one, and then come back to this one and then go to that one. She could separate her mind like that and dictate these poems to her secretaries. So she had Grover Cleveland, after the workday, he would take dictation to write her poetry for her. And there was at that time, the superintendent of the schools was really very strict, and he wanted everything to come through him. And now keep in mind, she's 29 years old. Actually, she's 33 years old at this time. And the superintendent came to them one evening and said, you need to be going through me. You're not supposed to be doing this without my permission. And he left. And Fanny, by this time, she's a teacher at the school now. I mean, she's been there since she's 15 years old. So she's now stayed on and she's a teacher. And Grover Cleveland said to her after the superintendent left, are you going to let him talk to you that way? I mean, you're a professor here. And she said, well, I don't know what to say. He said, you have to stand up for yourself and so say what you have to say and not let him do that. So the next night she went back down to Grover Cleveland's office and they were transcribing and she had her little speech ready and the superintendent came in again and started to admonish her and say, I told you you're not supposed to be here. And she didn't say exactly what she said to him, but she, in so many words, said, look, I'm a teacher here and I can use this if I want to, and the work's getting done. And after that, he never said another word to her. So she and Grover Cleveland spent a lot of time together. They formed a very, very close friendship. So then he moved on and did his thing. And as you know, that he became president, and he was president in 1885. He became president. So that they had a lifelong friendship. She was invited many times to the White House. She spoke there many times. So that was, I mean, she had a great network, and it's because of, being in the Institute. So let's talk about her first book was in 1844, and she wrote this, it really wasn't a book, it was a compilation of her poetry. And the title of it was Blind Girl and Other Poems. And the deal was, it really wasn't for her to have a book that she wanted to publish. The Institute thought, let's put all these poems together and sell them and make money for the Institute, and that's what they did. She didn't get any money from it. All the money from the proceeds from that book went to the school. In 1845 through 1848, Andrew Van Alstyne, who was then 15, came to be a student at the school, and they became friends. She was one of his teachers, and they became friends. Now, he's legally blind, but he has some light vision that he can see. So it goes on. I backed up, and now I'm going back again. Sorry about that. So in 1858, you can see that she resigns from the school because they were getting married, and in those days, you couldn't be married and be teaching at the school. So she resigned, and they moved across the river to Maspeth, New York. At that time, Maspeth was this little tiny quiet place, away from the hubbub, away from the busy city that she had been living in and navigated so well in, that they moved, and he kind of became reclusive. He was a brilliant musician. Played the organ, piano. She played the harp, the guitar, the piano. So they were both really beautiful musicians, and she would write poetry, and he would sometimes write some kind of music to go along, although he preferred non-singing music. He liked music only. He didn't care for words with the songs. There's only one mention anywhere about her marriage there, and she's only mentioned it once, where she, where her baby, where she had a baby. Just a second. So later in her life, she revealed that she had once been a mother. And see, this is something that's only, like, she only mentioned it one time in an interview, once, that she'd been a mother, and she said, "But the angels came down and took our infant up to God and to his throne." She never spoke publicly of motherhood again. She never elaborated on the experience. And the death of the child was very common in those days, but it didn't become part of any kind of her contemporary legend. And it happened probably in 1859, which was the year after they got married, because shortly during that year, they moved back to Manhattan. So they were only over there a year. And that year, she really does not ever talk about it. And we know that they moved back to Manhattan because there was a city directory in 1859 that revealed that they'd already left Maspeth and came back and were living on Spruce Street someplace. And she was, obviously brokenhearted over it, but she was one of those kind that moved on in the face of adversity. So she doesn't ever talk about that. Van insisted that she keep her own name because she was writing and publishing and traveling and speaking, and so he said, keep your own name as far as your public life goes. So when we talk about her, I just want to draw your attention to in that between 1850 and 1865, Zachary Taylor was in the White House as president. He died from cholera during that time. And he was succeeded by Millard Fillmore in 1750. So things started happening. The churches in Lower Manhattan started selling off to move uptown. And then we had that pluralism and the elitism of the Protestants in the 1860s all the way through those first probably 45, 50 years. So she had an outpouring of poems, of Civil War poems. And she wrote a lot of things. Some of them were actually gory. And she ended up at that time meeting George Root, who was a very famous Christian composer, gospel music composer. And they collaborated on a lot of things. He was probably the most prolific writer of Civil War music that has ever been from the North. They were definitely pro-North, and they wrote a lot of stuff about that. So she started working in the missions. There wasn't much in her about the assassination of President Lincoln. It happened 5 days after the war was ended, 5 days after the Confederates surrendered. On Good Friday, Lincoln was assassinated, as we know. And she never really wrote much about it, but it was in DC, she was in New York, certainly she heard about it, but I couldn't find any references to it in any of her, even in her autobiography. So then the next many years, I wrote on there some of the more famous hymns that you would be familiar with in the year that those were written. And in 1881, when she was 61 years old, she did her first mission to visit to the Bowery. It was only established like 2 years before that. She started doing mission work before that. You can see over the timeline on the far right corner in 75, that's when the first Muslim immigrants came to New York City, which was in 1875. And in 1878, we had Eddie, whatever, founded Christian Science. And then by the 1890s, Catholicism was like the biggest religion the biggest denomination of religion in the United States. So she, in these books, and there's several books over here that I've referred to, Her Heart Can See is a really detailed biography by Edith Blumenhofer. And it's, there's an extra copy here that's for our library, and it's a permanent addition to our library. And Dee said, which one of this, the 100 Christian Women, that's part of our library as well. And then these other two books have some little blurbs in them about Fanny's music. They're about lots of different things. And you can check those out if you want. She's checked those out from Mount Cross. But if you want to check them out, just, she's done her name, so sign them and make sure Dee gets them back. These two are permanent to our library downstairs. The one that Her Heart Can See is so detailed with her collaborations and her early music and her Sunday school music. It was just completely a whole nother situation, because my goal here was, I could have had 2 Sundays easily for her as I got into it, but she was such a complex person that that part of her life, when she went back to Manhattan in 1859, 1860s, and on to the end of her life in 1915, she did nothing but write and travel and speak. That's what she did. I mean, even into the very end of her life. She got involved writing for Moody and for Ira Sankey. They were very close friends. She spent lots of summers in these people's homes. She spoke publicly until 1911, when she was 91 years old. She was speaking and traveling. Her last poem was written in February 11th, 1905. And I want to read you that. It's a very quick one. She primarily dealt with, when she was in the missions, I want to talk about that for a minute, before I get to her final poem. I got a couple minutes here. Yeah, that's a little slow. When she wrote a lot of stuff for the missions, that really focused more on men than it did on women. She talked about the erring men, not so much the erring women. She offered more than forgiveness. She envisioned broken homes restored. And that the women in her ballads were about drunkenness, that the women were wrong, and they were gentle and forgiving. And here's one of the songs that she wrote. It's called She Is Coming Home Tomorrow. It's a setting for a hymn. And it was published in 1890. And here are the words. She is coming home tomorrow. Can the happy news be true? She is coming home tomorrow, and she'll bring the baby too. 'Twas my fault that ere she left me, oh my gentle, patient wife. It was I that crushed the roses and sunshine from her life. She's coming home tomorrow with her voice so sweet and low. I have been a cruel husband. 'Twas drink that made me so. But she's coming home tomorrow, and she'll love me as before. All the past will be forgiven, our lives begin once more. So these were kind of the hope and things that she based a lot of her mission work on, speaking kind words. She felt that speaking kind words to people went farther than harsh words and admonishments. So that's what she said that. So I want to talk very briefly about her marriage to Van, because they didn't live together. They lived separately for many decades. They never divorced. They never separated permanently. They even performed together at a reunion in 1905. So they hadn't lived together for decades. They did their own thing. And so people around her said that, During these years that she was separated, even though she was doing her mission work and writing her songs for the music publishing, her growing public appeal could not obscure the reality that her relationship with Van had been stressed for decades. Together and separately, they had moved frequently. In 1880s, records said that she left the familiar streets of Lower Manhattan and Van for better environments up on the Upper East Side. Now, we're not sure how much they saw of each other, but she had a very full life, and we really don't know what caused the rift between them. But in 1902, there was a telegram that came, and Bigelow and Maine were the publishers that she worked for. They sent her a telegram saying that Van had a massive stroke. He was living in New York at the time, and she was, at that time, she was living in Bridgeport, Connecticut, with her two half-sisters. So he'd had asthma for years. He may have also had cancer, and he'd been cared for in this couple's house. And then, it was in 1895 that they had played together. So he turned 70 in 1901, but he passed away from a massive stroke, and in 1902, in 1902. And when she got the news that he passed away, she went upstairs and she wrote this poem. Immediately upon hearing it, she went into her bedroom and closed the door. She was gone several hours. And when she came back, she dictated a new hymn to William Doane, who was another famous composer that she worked with. And it said, and the he in here refers to the Lord, not to her husband. If he, my Lord, is with me still, and I in him abide, if he but whisper to my heart, then I'm satisfied. Though pastures green and shadows deep, with him my constant guide, if step by step he leads me on, then I am satisfied. And though at times the things I ask in love are oft denied, I know he gives me what is best, and I am satisfied. For him my soul in life or death no power shall e'er divide. I read the promise in his word, and I am satisfied. Now, the absence of emotion and this are very striking. That's right after her husband dies. So, she wove that hymn, Safe in the Arms of Jesus, around people who had died before, but she never mentioned this when it came to Van. We know that she longed for a romantic love. In the 38 she found it, she thought, and they moved away. But they had some kind of a relationship. And so she never had a loving marriage that she kind of longed for. So that's kind of telling about, she said they remained friends until the very end. But let me see. So she wrote an autobiography in 1906, which was interesting, and that's one that's on my list of references at the bottom. In 1908, she made an annual trip to see three very close friends. One of them was Grover Cleveland. And 3 months later, all three of those friends died, including Grover Cleveland, who was only 71. So she begins her last trip to New York City in 1911. She was 91 years old. And she had her last collaboration. She had a poem with Doane about the war. And then her very last poem, the very last poem she dictated on the night before she died. She didn't feel well. And she said she wanted to stay in bed, but then her niece said she got up several times and came to the doorway to talk, which she always did at her room. And she refused food, but in the evening she sent for her secretary to take a letter to her family. And then she dictated this poem. In the morn of Zion's glory, when clouds have rolled away, and my hope has dropped its anchor in the veil of perfect day, when all the pure and holy I shall strike my heart anew, with a power no arm can sever, love will hold me fast and true. And the next morning she's had a massive stroke and died at the age of 94. She died on the federal holiday of Lincoln's birthday, which is February the 12th. And she had a really, really interesting life. She didn't want any kind of grand monuments. P.T. Barnum had erected a grand monument to himself in the cemetery in Bridgeport, Connecticut. And she didn't want anything like that. And even Morris had and I haven't had a picture of that, but it's still preparing. So, but there was a fairly decent sized one, and there was just a little tiny marker that said, and these pictures are in one of those books as well. It just said that Fanny did what she could. But then about a decade later, maybe actually a generation later, friends of Fanny Crosby got together and they erected a nicer monument to her. So it's still there in Bridgeport, Connecticut. Her husband was buried in Mount Olivet in Manhattan, and there is no grave marker there or anything. For some reason, her friend Phoebe Knapp was going to have a gravestone there, but there never was. So in closing, I just want to say that the evangelical community that Crosby helped form, it just came from the outset of her hymns that they were on shelves for a long time, and there's even a resurgence now. But she has a huge voice that has shaped modern Protestantism in our country and evangelicalism. So she really deserves a place among the people just because of her mission work. She didn't take money. She never made any royalties from any of the songs that she wrote with Bigelow. She never got any royalties for anything. They paid her $1 or $2 a song, but she never really wanted for anything. Someone always took care of her. She lived in the institution from the time she was 15 till she was 38, and after that she had someone, secretaries, to take down her message. So I would encourage you to read some of her things if you want to. And I have 1 minute left just to tell you that there's a new album out that's called Blessed Assurance, the New Hymns of Fanny Crosby. It's brand new. It's on Amazon Music. And it's taken a couple of her older hymns, but they found a bunch of other ones that some newer people have put music to some words that she wrote. She only wrote 1 or 2 music, the tune itself. Mostly she always wrote the lyrics. So you can look through. There's 16 of Fanny Crosby's hymns in our hymnal that we know of. She had over 100 pseudonyms. So in the book it lists a bunch of her pseudonyms as well. And I haven't taken the time to go through our hymnal and see if there's any of her pseudonyms written in our hymnal. But there are 16 of her songs. So that's all I have. If you have any questions.
Thank you, Joanne. Thank you.
That's good.
Yeah, she was.